Rain needled Rebecca Schmidt's face and slipped down the back of her collar in a cold line that made her shoulders knot against the basket balanced on her hip. Dawn had not properly broken. The sky over Bath was a hard slate colour, the kind that gave no promise of sun, only a paler shade of wet grey. Her dress, mended twice at the hem and once at the elbow, darkened with water until the wool clung to her knees and dragged at each step. She had wrapped the damp linens in a cloth to keep them from soaking through entirely, yet the bundle had already taken in rain and grown heavier, and every jolt of its weight pressed into the sore place along her ribs where Mrs. Winterhale's fan had struck her 3 evenings earlier. She walked quickly because she had been told to walk quickly, because the parcels at the Bath Coaching Exchange were to be collected in person, because a woman who owned 3 silk travelling mantles preferred not to let her own shoes touch mud. She walked on an empty stomach. The kitchen girl had looked at her with apology before dawn and said very softly that there was no tray for Miss Schmidt this morning. Hunger moved in her like a small clenched hand, twisting, unclenching, twisting again. A fishmonger's boy paused under an awning and watched her when she slipped on a ribbon of moss between cobbles. 2 ladies in a hired chaise looked through the rain-spattered glass and then looked away with the swift discomfort of those who had seen something indecent in full street light. Not nakedness, only want. Rebecca kept her head bowed, dark hair pinned badly under a plain bonnet gone limp with wet, and continued down the lane as carriages rattled past and sent up fans of brown water that spotted her skirt from calf to ankle. By the time she turned into the coaching yard, her fingers had gone numb, then begun to burn as feeling returned in stabbing pulses. The place was already loud despite the hour. Ostlers shouted over one another, horses stamped and snorted steam, wheels ground over stone. A porter dragged trunks slick with rain and swore at a broken strap. The smell was a thick mixture of wet hay, coal smoke, leather and horse dung made thin only by the weather. Rebecca stood just inside the yard gate and waited to be noticed by the clerk behind the receiving table, though her shoes let in water at both soles and her stockings were wet to the ankle bone. No one looked up. Men with signet rings and polished boots pushed past her toward the covered entry. A woman in lavender silk lifted her skirts with 2 fingers to avoid brushing Rebecca's sleeve, then frowned as if Rebecca had chosen to occupy the path merely to offend her. When the clerk finally spoke, he did not speak to her face. He spoke to the ledger in front of him. "Name." She gave it. His brows rose at Schmidt, then settled into bored indifference. He pointed with his quill toward a pile of tied parcels and said, "For Winterhale House. Wait there." She crossed to the wall and set her basket down. Her arms trembled with relief for one brief moment, then a stable hand called her back before she could straighten fully. Mrs. Winterhale's town boots had come in caked with road mud from yesterday's call, and were to be cleaned before she returned, because the maid usually tasked with such work had a fever, and Rebecca, as Mrs. Winterhale often said in company, was useful when properly instructed. A wooden pail stood under the eaves with rainwater gone grey. A rag lay beside it, stiff at one corner from old polish. Rebecca knelt on stone already slick with muck and took the first boot into her lap. Cold water sank through her skirt at once. She scrubbed in small circles because hard scraping ruined the leather and earned sharper punishment later. Mud loosened and streaked her hands. Grit worked under her nails. The water in the pail turned darker with each dip of the rag until she could not tell where the polish ended and stable filth began. Gentlemen crossed the yard in pairs, cloaks swinging, voices clipped with morning urgency. They stepped around her with practised precision, not out of courtesy, but because they did not wish to soil their cuffs. One of them stopped long enough to ask, without looking at her directly, whether his carriage had been brought round. When she answered that she did not know, he made a small, impatient sound and moved on, as if the fault lay in her refusal to be the person he had imagined. Her jaw ached where skin had yellowed over last week's bruise, a tender place just below the cheekbone that flared whenever she clenched her teeth. She kept her mouth carefully loose. Her hands were raw where soap had stripped them through winter and spring, and now rainwater found each tiny crack like salt. The split in her left shoe had widened from heel toward arch. When she shifted on her knees, she felt cold seep up through stocking and into bone. The hunger in her belly sharpened and then dulled to a heavy hollow, and she had learned that this second stage was worse because it made her thoughts slow. She counted brush strokes under her breath to keep steady. 12 along the side seam, 8 around the heel, 4 over the toe where mud had dried hardest. When the rag snagged on a decorative buckle, she stopped at once and eased it free with fingers that shook despite her effort to still them. A laugh rose behind her, bright and careless. 2 young men from one of the northbound coaches were watching while they waited for their horses to be harnessed. She heard one ask whether Winterhale House had dismissed all proper servants if they sent pale little cousins to do boot work in rain. The other answered that perhaps poverty had become fashionable. They were not cruel in any deliberate sense. They were entertained. That made it harder to bear. Rebecca lowered her head farther and lifted the second boot. The leather was finer. Mrs. Winterhale had ordered these from London in the spring and complained for a week that the stitch line was uneven, though no one else could see it. Rebecca could see it now. One row of thread barely misaligned near the inner ankle. She could also see, reflected dimly in the wet black surface she had begun to clean, the shape of her own face, thin from months of rationed meals, eyes too large in the morning half-light, a strand of dark hair loose against her cheek. Plain, Mrs. Winterhale called her, and burdensome, and ungrateful for shelter. The words had been repeated so often that they moved through the house like routine prayer. Rebecca had learned the positions required to survive them, eyes lowered, shoulders level, no answer unless questioned directly, no tears where anyone could witness them. If tears came at all, they came once the attic door was bolted, and only long enough to sting before she wiped them away with the heel of her palm and set out her dress for the next day. She drew breath now through her nose, slow and measured, and worked polish into the softened leather until it took a dull shine despite the weather. A cartwheel struck a rut near the gate. Mud sprayed across her apron and the cuff she had mended 2 nights ago, by candlelight. She did not pause. When both boots were clean, she rose too quickly and had to brace one hand against the wall, while the yard tipped sideways and righted itself. No one noticed. The clerk shouted for signatures at the far table. A coachman cursed at a balking mare. Somewhere above the stable roofs, a church bell struck the 1/4 hour thin through rain. Rebecca carried the boots to the covered entry, left them where instructed, and returned for the parcels tied in rough twine, each one tagged in a hand she recognised from Mrs. Winterhale's milliner, glove-maker, and perfumer, silk ribbon from London, new fans, scented powder, a packet of French pins, goods bought for evenings at assembly rooms where Mrs. Winterhale would speak of economies and debts as if she alone had suffered them. Rebecca lifted the parcels into her basket atop the damp linens and adjusted the weight against her side, swallowing once against the sharp protest in her ribs. The yard had begun to fill in earnest now, people arriving dry under umbrellas held by hired boys, people departing with cloaks brushed and collars straightened by servants who called them Sir and My Lady. Rebecca stepped back into the rain without umbrella, without breakfast, without witness who counted, and turned toward home through streets that had once opened for her father's carriage and now opened only to let her pass unnoticed. She kept walking because stillness had never been granted to her, and because by noon, Mrs. Winterhale would ask, in front of guests if possible, why the errand had taken so long. She turned into Milsom Street with the basket dragging at her shoulder, and the familiar facades rose through rain like stern faces she had once believed would always open to her. When she had been 10, Matthias Schmidt's carriage had stopped at these same doors, while merchants bowed and called him Sir with genuine eagerness, because ships bearing his mark came up the Avon, loaded with wool, dye, and timber, and men who moved goods in winter were treated as men who moved kingdoms. She remembered his gloves drying by the hearth. She remembered ink on his cuffs. She remembered being allowed to stand at his desk on Sundays while he traced routes with the blunt end of a quill and explained currents, tariffs, and risk in a voice so patient that numbers seemed less like cold marks and more like weather to be read correctly. He had said that debt was a tool when measured and a noose when hidden. He had said that records were a person's shield against both malice and error. Then 2 ships failed to make port in one season, and a third came in with ruined cargo after storms along the Channel, and the men who had smiled over wine began requesting private meetings with ledgers already open to the pages that favoured them. Rebecca had watched the rhythm of her father's days collapse. Fewer dinners at home, more letters sealed after midnight, a cough he ignored until it deepened and took hold of his chest. By the winter she turned 19, he could no longer climb the stair, without stopping at the landing to breathe through pain he dismissed as fatigue. She had brought him broth and found him staring at columns of figures with that same blunt quill in his hand, not writing, only looking, as if the numbers had shifted shape while he slept, and he alone had noticed. 3 weeks later he was gone, and the house became a stage where every object waited to be claimed by someone stronger. The rain struck her bonnet brim. Water ran down the bridge of her nose and tasted of soot. She tightened her grip on the basket and kept walking because each stone underfoot carried 2 versions of the street at once, the one that had held her father upright and the one that carried her now, wet, hungry, and invisible, past shop windows where clerks no longer knew her name. Her mother had died when Rebecca was 12, long before the debts, long before Mrs. Winterhale's perfume settled into every curtain like a sweet rot that did not lift even in summer. Matthias had married again out of weariness and propriety, not passion, and he had told Rebecca carefully that households required order and that a woman of standing would steady the social obligations he could not meet while managing trade. Lenora Winterhale arrived with trunks, lace, and 2 daughters who were nearly grown and immediately certain of their own precedence. Augusta was all bright ribbons and practised sighs. Clara wore mockery like jewellery and never repeated an insult once she found a fresher one. At first their cruelty had the polished edge of amusement. Rebecca's seat moved 1 place down at table, then 2. Her books from the morning room were shifted to a side cabinet because the sisters required space for sheet music. Her mother's shawl, the blue one with the repaired fringe, disappeared from her chair and reappeared cut into cushion ties for Augusta's lapdog. Mrs. Winterhale smiled with narrow lips and called such changes practical. After Matthias died, practicality became law. Locks were changed on the front writing room. The silver inventory was revised in a hand not her father's. Servants who had known Rebecca since childhood were dismissed in batches and replaced by cheaper staff, loyal to wages rather than memory. Mrs. Winterhale spoke of sacrifice in drawing rooms and spoke of burden in corridors, always loud enough for Rebecca to hear and soft enough to deny intent when challenged. "You are fortunate," she would say while fastening pearls at her throat. "Many girls in your position would have no roof at all." If guests were present, she added, with a little laugh that invited agreement, "My poor stepdaughter has no head for accounts. She would have signed us all into ruin had I not intervened." The guests, eager to avoid discomfort, laughed with her. Rebecca learned to stand by the tea tray and pour without spilling while her own history was rewritten 3 feet away. On days when Mrs. Winterhale wanted sharper obedience, she withheld meals under the name of discipline. On days she wanted spectacle, she sent Rebecca on errands that should have been assigned to boys from the yard, then asked before company why her hem was muddy and why she looked so pale. Augusta and Clara echoed every line, not because it profited them greatly, but because cruelty had become the house language and fluency earned praise. Debt gave that cruelty structure. Men with legal satchels came and went through the side parlour where Rebecca had once practised German verbs with her father. She was told to pour tea and keep her eyes down. She obeyed with the stillness of someone counting exits in a burning room. Amounts were spoken. Interest was explained. New instruments were drafted to settle old instruments that had, according to Mrs. Winterhale, been carelessly executed during Matthias's final illness. Each week something left the house. First the less visible items, cellar wine and spare plate, then paintings from the upper hall, then clocks, carpets, and finally the books. Her father's library went in 3 wagons, and she stood at an attic window with both hands on the sill, while a porter tossed volumes into crates marked for auction, as if they were split logs and not years of his mind. She had hidden what she could in apron folds over the months before, one slim Virgil, a Psalter with a cracked spine, and a merchant's ledger from the year before he died. But Mrs. Winterhale searched her room twice and found the Virgil and Psalter beneath her mattress. The ledger survived because she had separated one page and folded it small enough to stitch inside the lining of her sleeve, then re-sewn the seam with thread pulled from an old petticoat. That page held an entry in Matthias's hand, and the receiving stamp of Harrow and Blight, the largest creditor, marked paid in full 11 days before his death. She had read it by candlelight until the numbers lived behind her eyes. She had shown it once, trembling, to Mrs. Winterhale in the morning room, while rain hit the panes much as it did now. Mrs. Winterhale had taken the page without comment, scanned it, and then returned it with 2 fingers, as if it were dirty cloth. "You misunderstand commercial notation," she had said. "Do not embarrass yourself by speaking of this to men who conduct real business." When Rebecca answered quietly that she could read figures as well as any clerk in Bath, Mrs. Winterhale struck her with the folded fan she carried even indoors. Not hard enough to mark openly, hard enough to teach. "You will not mention private papers again," she said. "You will not make accusations you cannot prove. You will not forget that your shelter depends on my charity." After that day, Rebecca kept the page against her skin and never produced it in the house. She memorised every column, every blot of ink, every pen stroke in her father's M. She also memorised the names of solicitors who stopped asking questions once Mrs. Winterhale invited them to supper with her daughters and spoke of preserving respectability. 3 days passed after the library auction before Rebecca was moved from her old chamber to the attic. The room was narrow, sloped, and so cold in winter that water filmed ice inside the wash basin. A cot, a blanket gone thin at the centre, a stool with one repaired leg. She accepted it because refusal required authority she did not possess. She survived it because endurance was the one asset no creditor could seize. By the time she reached Winterhale House, the rain had softened to a fine, relentless mist that beaded on the brass knocker and made the stone steps shine like polished bone. She did not go to the front door. She never went to the front door now. She crossed to the side entrance by the kitchens, where coal dust darkened the threshold and deliveries were expected, and shifted the basket to her other hip as pain tightened under her ribs in a bright, clean line. Through the half-open scullery window came the smell of toast she had not been given, and coffee meant for the breakfast room upstairs. Her stomach clenched so sharply that she had to pause once with her hand on the jam before stepping inside. Martha, the undercook, glanced up from a chopping board, and her eyes moved at once to Rebecca's wet sleeves, her mud-streaked apron, the white knuckles around the basket handle. "Set it there," Martha whispered, nodding toward the long table, "and wipe your face. She is in one of her tempers." Rebecca placed the parcels carefully, untied the damp cloth from the linens, and began sorting by label because speed reduced comment. Milliner goods to the right, perfumer packet away from the stove heat, pins wrapped in paper and set high where Clara would not spill them and accuse someone else. She slid one hand, quick and unseen, along the seam of her left sleeve and felt the faint ridge where the folded ledger page rested against her skin. Present, dry enough, still hers. Upstairs, a bell rang twice in impatient succession. Footsteps crossed the passage. Mrs. Winterhale entered with the rustle of expensive silk and the cool scent of rosewater that always arrived half a second before her voice. Augusta and Clara followed in morning wrappers, each with ribbons still in their hair from the previous evening, each carrying the easy malice of women who had slept warm and eaten well. Mrs. Winterhale's gaze took in Rebecca's soaked hem, her reddened hands, the parcels arranged in neat rows, and settled not on effort, but on fault. "Late," she said, "and look at you! You drip on my floor." Rebecca lowered her eyes as required. "The yard was crowded, ma'am." "The parcels are complete." Clara gave a small laugh. "Complete," she says, as if she negotiated treaties. Augusta lifted the packet from the perfumer and frowned at the watermark on the outer paper. "If my violet powder is ruined, you shall pay for it." Rebecca knew she could not pay for anything at all. The statement was not meant to be answered. Mrs. Winterhale stepped closer and adjusted Rebecca's collar with two brisk fingers that looked almost maternal until the grip tightened at the bruised edge of her jaw. "You will change at once," she said softly, too softly. "Then you will inventory the silver in the blue dining room. We have callers tonight. You will remain out of sight unless summoned. And you will remember what I have told you about old accounts. The dead are dead, Rebecca. Gratitude is the only debt you can afford." She released her. The skin along Rebecca's jaw burned where pressure had landed. She inclined her head and said, "Yes, ma'am," because open defiance would cost food, sleep, or both, and because there were battles that required timing rather than courage alone. She lifted the emptied basket, turned toward the servants' stair, and climbed with wet shoes squeaking against wood, while downstairs china clinked and laughter resumed. And in the narrow space between one breath and the next, she held to the one unpurchased truth she possessed. Her father had paid what he owed, and somewhere beyond this house the figure that could free her still existed, waiting for a hand willing to read it honestly. She had reached the turn where the servants' stair narrowed under the eaves when the front bell began to hammer below, not once but in rapid metallic bursts that made the banister tremble in her hand. A second sound followed at once, not a knock, a crack like timber split by frost, sharp enough to silence the kitchen for one stunned heartbeat before shouting rose from the street. Rebecca stopped on the step, basket against her knee, listening as hooves struck stone in a frantic rhythm, and someone cried out for help in a voice pitched so high it thinned into air. Mrs. Winterhale's tone cut through all of it from the lower passage. "Rebecca, down, now!" She descended at once, Wetham slapping her ankles, and found the side hall in disorder. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway with flour on both hands and fear across her face. Clara was at the front window clutching the curtain edge. Augusta had both palms over her ears as if sound alone could stain her. Mrs. Winterhale turned, silk rustling hard against the panelling. "There has been an accident at the corner. The lane is blocked. Mr. Pelham's clerk cannot reach us with the debt packet, and he is to have my acknowledgment by noon. You will go around through the coaching yard and fetch it yourself. Do not stare. Do not speak to anyone. Bring the red waxed packet straight to me." Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, and the bell rang again, longer this time, followed by a boy's ragged cry from the street. Mrs. Winterhale's eyes narrowed. "Move!" Rebecca set down the empty basket, took the dark mantle hanging by the service door, and ran into mist that had thickened back into rain. The lane outside Winterhale House was already choking with carriages, forced nose to nose by a broken axle cart at the far bend. Wheels ground. Men cursed. A groom tried to back a bay, gelding through too little space, while an ostler waved both arms and shouted directions no one obeyed. Rebecca slipped between a brewer's dray and a travelling chaise, mud striking her stockings in cold fans, then cut through the alley behind the apothecary toward the Bath Exchange, where traffic from the London road was often rerouted when city lanes seized. She could smell iron and wet leather before she saw the inn-gate. Inside, the yard was a spinning knot of bodies and horseflesh. A black carriage with silver crestwork had slewed sideways against the mounting block. One rear wheel burst in splintered arcs across the cobbles. One horse had gone to its knees and was fighting the traces. The other reared and came down, stamping. Eyes rolled white, while two stable hands kept their distance and shouted at each other instead of touching the harness. Near the fallen wheel, a small figure in a navy coat lay curled on one side, not under the horse, but close enough that each strike of hoof against stone sent vibration through his slight frame. He made no sound now. His mouth hung open. His chest did not seem to rise. Rebecca did not think. She ran. She heard someone yell for her to keep back and another voice order everyone clear, but her skirt was already soaked through at the knees as she dropped beside the child and slid both hands under his shoulders to drag him across the slick cobbles toward the shelter of the wall. He was lighter than he looked, all sharp elbows and rigid limbs. His head lolled against her arm. Rain hit his face. She wiped it away with her sleeve and rolled him carefully onto his back, then onto his side when his throat made a wet, trapped sound that turned her blood cold. "Breathe," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear. "Come now, breathe." Boots struck stone beside her. A tall man in a black greatcoat was suddenly there, mud to his calves, gloves gone, one hand reaching for the child with a precision that was almost violent. He had come down from the driver's step before any servant could catch him. She saw that in the angle of the dangling reins and the absence of footman at his shoulder. Rain beaded on his dark hair and ran off the hard line of his jaw. His face was controlled to the edge of severity, yet his eyes, a storm grey made colder by weather, were fixed on the boy with a stillness that looked like strain held by force. "Julian!" The single name was low and clipped. No panic in the sound, panic everywhere beneath it. Rebecca pressed 2 fingers at the child's throat, pulse thin and rapid. She tipped his chin, cleared mud from his lips, and felt a shallow exhale skim her knuckles. Behind them, a woman in travelling veils began to sob. Somewhere, a wheelwright shouted for rope. The man beside her did not look up. He said, "You are bleeding. Stop moving." She followed his gaze and saw a narrow cut along the back of her hand, probably from the shattered spoke, rain washing pink away as fast as it surfaced. "The child cannot breathe," she said, already easing the boy's cravat loose. The man's attention shifted to her then. abrupt and assessing. Command lived in every inch of him. "Leave him. My physician is coming." She had heard that tone before from magistrates in corridors, from men who signed papers that altered lives and never looked at faces while they signed. She ignored it. She bent closer, lifted Julian's shoulders, and thumped once between his shoulder blades with the heel of her palm. Then again, less force, listening. The child convulsed and coughed hard, a thick choke that turned into a gasp so sudden it seemed to tear him open. Air came, then another ragged breath, his fingers clenched in her sleeve. The yard exhaled in a collective murmur, relief and disbelief braided together. The man beside her stayed very still. He was the first to move when the horse bucked again. Without taking his eyes from the boy, he stood and turned enough to cut through the clamour with 2 words. "Hold him!" The nearest stable hand flinched, then obeyed at once, catching the bridle and leaning his full weight to the trembling animal's neck until the stamping eased. The man dropped back to one knee beside Rebecca. Rain had darkened his coat to ink. A white scar ran from just under his left ear to the collar line, old and pale against winter skin. She knew him now. Everyone in Bath knew the profile from newspapers, from ballrooms, from whispered tales passed over supper tables by people who wanted to feel near power while pretending to despise it. Duke Elias Ashcombe, widowed at 32, land rich enough to purchase half the county, temper reputed colder than January water. He had the reputation of a man who punished insult with legal ruin and dismissed servants for trembling. She had expected, if she ever stood in his presence, to feel smaller than she already was. Instead, she felt only the weight of Julian's hand clutching her cuff, and the iron focus of the Duke's attention as he watched each movement she made. "Can he swallow?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "Keep him on his side. If he retches, do not roll him flat." She realised only after speaking that she had issued an instruction to a duke in full public yard. Heat rose under her rain-chilled skin, shame and defiance arriving together. He did not rebuke her. He slid one arm under the child with care so controlled it looked painful, settling Julian against his chest, and nodded once, as if she had stated the weather. A physician in a drab cloak burst through the crowd carrying a leather case, breathless and indignant. "Your Grace, stand aside!" The title rang through the yard and made heads turn in a visible ripple. Rebecca froze for the smallest beat. Her hands were muddy to the wrist. Her skirt was plastered to her legs. She was kneeling in muck inches from a duke's boots. The physician crouched, examined Julian's pupils, listened at his chest, and muttered about shock, airway spasm, and luck. He must be kept warm and watched through the day, no jolting roads. The Duke answered without looking away from the boy. "We return to Norfield House now." He rose in one fluid motion with Julian in his arms and then, as if remembering the person still kneeling in rain, turned his head toward Rebecca. Close, he looked less like rumour and more like carved restraint. Mud streaked his cheekbone. His mouth was a hard line that had forgotten softness years ago. His gaze dropped once, swift and exact, to her soaked sleeve, torn cuff, and split shoe, visible where her hem had ridden up in the struggle. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, meant for her alone, despite the crowd pressing close. "Stand." She did, unsteady. The world tilted and steadied with painful slowness. The clerk from Winterhale's solicitor had appeared near the gate clutching a satchel with a red seal, forgotten entirely in the upheaval. He stared at Rebecca as if she had stepped outside her proper shape and might not fit back into it. She forced breath into her lungs and held out her hand for the packet. The clerk gave it over mutely. Her fingers closed around wax gone damp from rain. Duty returned like a yoke across her shoulders. She turned toward the gate, but the Duke's next words stopped her where she stood. "You will ride with us." She faced him fully then, rain running off her bonnet brim into her eyes. "My place is at Winterhale House, Your Grace. I was sent on errand only." "Your place," he said, "was under a rearing team while my servants shouted." A murmur moved through the onlookers. Rebecca felt it like heat against her neck, curiosity sharpening into gossip. She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Winterhale expects this packet." His expression did not alter. "Then Mrs. Winterhale will wait." The physician cleared his throat, glancing from Duke to girl with visible discomfort. "Your Grace, the child should not be surrounded by strangers." "He is already surrounded by incompetence," Ashcombe said. "Miss Schmidt stays until I dismiss her." The use of her name struck harder than the command. She had not given it. He must have heard the clerk call to her, or remembered it from the yard records, or asked someone during the frantic first minutes while she was bent over Julian and not listening. The mechanism did not matter. He had noticed. She should have refused. Prudence demanded refusal. A single carriage ride in a Duke's company could be twisted into scandal by supper, and scandal was a weapon Mrs. Winterhale used with pleasure. Yet Julian made a small, frightened sound against his father's shoulder and reached blindly toward where Rebecca stood. Instinct moved before strategy. She stepped closer and let the boy's fingers find her sleeve. He quieted at once. Ashcombe watched that happen, and something unreadable tightened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite surprise, not softness. Recognition, perhaps, of a fact he had not planned for. He gestured toward the carriage, now righted enough for travel once the damaged wheel was replaced by a spare. "Inside," he said. She climbed in opposite him, skirts dripping onto polished wood she had no right to stain. Julian lay with his head in his father's lap, one small hand still hooked in Rebecca's cuff, as if cloth were anchor. Outside, men shoved the broken wheel aside. The crowd thickened at the gate, faces intent with that hungry attention reserved for misfortune and rank. Ashcombe rapped once, on the roof. The carriage lurched, then rolled forward through rain and watching eyes, carrying a duke, his son, and a drenched debtor's daughter toward Norfield House, while the red-waxed packet for Mrs. Winterhale grew warm in Rebecca's clenched fist. The carriage rocked hard over a rut, and Julian's fingers tightened on Rebecca's cuff until the seam bit into her skin. His breathing had returned, yet each inhale came shallow and fast, as if his chest had forgotten the correct rhythm and feared to trust it. She shifted to the edge of the seat, despite the red-waxed packet still crushed in her left hand, and leaned close enough to feel the heat of the child's skin through his wet coat. "His collar is too tight," she said. The Duke did not argue this time. He slid one gloved finger under the boy's cravat and loosened the knot with movements that were efficient but careful. His knuckles were scraped raw where the reins or broken wood had caught him in the yard. Rain tapped the roof in a relentless pattern. Wheels hissed through standing water. Bath passed in blurred greys beyond the glass. Julian's lashes fluttered. His mouth moved. "Papa!" "I am here." Ashcombe's voice stayed level. "Breathe slowly." The boy tried and failed. Panic rose through his narrow body in visible waves. Rebecca set the red packet on the seat beside her and offered her hand, palm up, where Julian could see it when his eyes opened again. He found her fingers with a blind, searching movement and held on. "Look at me," she said softly. "Not at the window, at me. One breath in, now out. That is right." Ashcombe watched her hand around his son's. His gaze was direct, unblinking, difficult to endure. Yet he followed her lead without comment, matching his own breathing to the count she gave the child. By the time the carriage turned through iron gates and into a long gravel sweep, Julian's breaths had deepened enough to stop the harsh whistling in his throat. Rebecca did not release him. The packet's red seal had smeared against the upholstery where rain from her sleeve touched it, and dread pricked at her spine when she saw that stain. Mrs. Winterhale would ask where she had gone. She would ask in front of others. She would draw the answer out like wire. Rebecca folded the fear down and kept her attention on the child. Norfield House rose from the rain with dark stone walls and high windows that held no warmth from outside. Footmen hurried down the steps with lanterns, then halted when they saw who sat inside the carriage. Their surprise landed first on the Duke's mud-streaked coat, and then, with sharper confusion, on Rebecca's soaked dress and bare, reddened hands. No one spoke until Ashcombe stepped to the ground with Julian in his arms. "Nursery wing," he said. "Send for Dr. Hale. Hot water, dry linen, now." A butler bowed and moved at once. Two maids stared openly at Rebecca, then lowered their eyes when the Duke turned his head toward them. "You," he said to her, as if there were no room for refusal in the world. "With us." She picked up the packet and followed across black and white marble that reflected lamplight in cold squares. Her wet shoes left marks with every step. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and the faint medicinal sharpness of vinegar from recently scrubbed surfaces. Portraits lined the walls in heavy gilt frames. Stern men, pale women, inherited certainty. None of them had ever knelt in mud to drag a choking child clear of hooves. The thought flashed through her and disappeared. Up 2 flights, the nursery corridor was warmer. A fire had been laid in the schoolroom grate, and the heat hit her wet sleeves like a sting. Ashcombe laid Julian on a narrow daybed near the hearth. The boy's eyes opened briefly, unfocused, then fixed on Rebecca over his father's shoulder. "Do not go," he whispered. She stopped where she stood. The red packet dug into her palm. The Duke did not look at her when he answered his son. "She will remain until you sleep." The words should have felt like protection. They felt like a chain made of duty and consequence. Yet, when Julian's hand reached again, she crossed the room and took it. "Doctor." Hale arrived within minutes, a square-shouldered man with silver at his temples and rain still shining on his hat brim. He examined Julian briskly, asked clipped questions, and cut away the boy's torn sleeve to inspect a scrape along the forearm and a deeper split near the elbow where he had struck stone. When he asked for fresh bandages, a maid produced a tray and then stood motionless, eyes wide at the sight of blood-diluted pink in basin water. "Hold still, Master Julian," the physician said. Julian did not hold still. He recoiled from the cloth, breath quickening again, shoulder jerking away each time Dr. Hale approached the wound. The motion opened the cut farther. Ashcombe stepped forward, and the child flinched at his father's looming shadow, not from fear of him, but from fear itself, now searching for any shape to attach to. Rebecca spoke without planning to. "He cannot be restrained while frightened. Give him a task." Dr. Hale frowned. "A task?" "A count, a story. Anything with numbers, please." The physician hesitated. Ashcombe's gaze moved from Rebecca to Hale, and that was enough. "Do as she says," the Duke said. The doctor withdrew a fraction. Rebecca sat on the edge of the daybed and placed a folded towel in Julian's uninjured hand. "Can you hold this for me?" she asked. "You must keep it very flat. If it wrinkles, we begin again." His breathing hitched. "I can hold it." "I know." She nodded to Dr. Hale, who cleaned the wound while Julian stared at the towel and whispered numbers under his breath. 1 to 10, 10 to 1. Again. When he trembled, Rebecca steadied his wrist. When he swallowed hard, she kept her voice even. The dressing was done cleanly. No tearing, no shout. Dr. Hale sat back with a look that mixed relief and professional annoyance at having needed instruction from a drenched stranger. "He will ache by nightfall," the physician said to Ashcombe. "No fever signs yet. Keep him warm, wake him every hour until morning. If breathing worsens, send at once." He turned to Rebecca then, taking her in properly for the first time. "Where did you learn airway positioning and shock response, Miss Schmidt?" she said. "Miss Schmidt." "My father employed river pilots," she answered. "Men were pulled from water often enough. I watched." It was not the full truth. She had done more than watch. She had held lamps, boiled instruments, pressed cloth against wounds, while the ship surgeon barked orders in the warehouse office that became infirmary each winter. But those memories belonged to a life no one in this house would credit. Dr. Hale gave a short nod and began packing his case. "Continue as you have done. It was correct." When he departed, the room changed. Urgency remained, but formal authority left with him, and in the quiet that followed, Rebecca became acutely aware of her own state. Mud at her hem, hair coming loose, hands still shaking once the immediate need had passed. The red packet sat on a side table now, water-stained and accusatory. Ashcombe stood by the hearth, one hand braced on the mantel, shoulders rigid beneath his coat. He had not removed it. Rain had dried in dark patches along the wool. He seemed carved into stillness, and only the flex of his jaw betrayed strain. "You will eat," he said, without preface. She blinked at him. "Your Grace, I must return to Winterhale House. I carry legal papers, expected by noon." He looked at the clock on the mantel. "It is already noon." The number struck her like cold water down the spine. She had not felt the hours move. Mrs. Winterhale would have counted each quarter hour with pleasure. Ashcombe read something in her face and spoke again, quieter. "Send a note. My carriageman will deliver it." "I cannot write what occurred without interpretation." "Then write that my son required assistance. Sign your name. No one will challenge my seal. No one, perhaps, except a woman who used challenge as sport." Rebecca lifted her chin a little. "Mrs. Winterhale challenges whatever serves her." For the first time his mouth shifted. Not a smile, a small, hard recognition. "I am not Mrs. Winterhale." A housekeeper entered then, grey-haired, straight-backed, carrying a tray with broth, bread and tea. She took one look at Rebecca's soaked dress and set down the tray with quiet efficiency. "I am Mrs. Davies," she said. "If you will allow, Miss Schmidt, I can find you a dry gown while your own is aired." Rebecca glanced toward Julian. His eyes were closed now, lashes still wet, one hand resting on the towel as if it were a command he dared not disobey in sleep. "I should not leave him." Mrs. Davies followed her gaze. "Then I shall bring blankets, and you may change behind the screen." Ashcombe moved to the door. "Do it!" He left without another word, taking the room's pressure with him and leaving a different tension in its place. One Rebecca trusted less because it came wrapped as care. Mrs. Davies closed the door and looked at Rebecca with an expression that held no mockery, only measured concern. "You are shivering," she said. "Sit. Drink before you fall." Rebecca sat because her knees had begun to quiver and could not be reasoned with. The broth was rich and salted, and the first swallow hurt her throat from hunger and relief arriving together. She did not realize she had tears in her eyes until one touched the rim of the cup. She wiped it away at once with the heel of her hand. By late afternoon, the rain had thickened into steady sheets that blurred the nursery windows and turned the courtyard below into dark glass. Julian woke crying once, disoriented, and reached for his mother by name that no one answered. Rebecca took his hand and told him where he was, what day it was, how many candles burned in the room, grounding him in facts until his breath slowed. She read from a slim book of fables Mrs. Davies found in the schoolroom cabinet. When his eyelids sagged, she set the book aside and hummed very low, a German lullaby her father had used during storms when freight rattled in the docks and she, as a child, had feared the roof would tear away. She did not know the Duke had returned. She did not hear the door open soundlessly and close to a hand's width. She only felt Julian's fingers unclench one by one against her palm as sleep finally took him, and kept humming until his face lost its drawn, frightened look. The song ended. Silence held. "Where did you learn that?" Ashcombe's voice came from the doorway, quieter than she had heard it all day. Rebecca turned sharply and rose, pulse jumping. "Your Grace! I did not hear you." He remained where he was, one shoulder against the frame, as if crossing the threshold would alter something he was unwilling to test. Lamplight cut across his face, leaving his eyes in shadow. "The lullaby," he said. "Where?" "My father learned it from a nurse in Hamburg," she answered. "He sang it when weather was poor." A long pause followed. Rain pressed against the panes. "My mother's nurse used the same melody," he said at last. "Westphalian variant. Rare here." Rebecca did not know what to do with the information. She looked down at Julian and adjusted the blanket at his shoulder. "He quieted to it. That is all that mattered." Ashcombe watched her hand on the blanket, then the frayed edge of her cuff, then the bandaged cut on her own hand which no one had dressed. His gaze was clinical in its precision, almost severe, and still she felt seen in a way that unsettled more than contempt ever had. "Why did you do it?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Because he could not breathe." "That is not what I asked." The question hung between them, stripped of ornament. Why run toward danger for strangers? Why stay when scandal waited like a trap at home? Why continue to serve a house that starved her? She could not answer any of those truths in a duke's nursery with his sleeping son between them. "He is a child," she said finally. "No other reason is required." Something changed in Ashcombe's expression then, slight as a shift of shadow across stone. He looked away first toward the fire, jaw tightening around words not spoken. A knock sounded at the outer door. Mrs. Davies entered with writing paper and sealing wax on a tray. "Your Grace, the note for Winterhale House, if Miss Schmidt is ready." Rebecca stared at the blank page. Ink waited. So did consequence. She wrote in a careful hand that Master Julian Ashcombe had suffered an accident, that immediate aid had been necessary, that she remained temporarily at Norfield House by instruction of His Grace. She signed, sanded, and sealed under the Duke's crest when he pressed his ring into wax, without comment. Mrs. Davies took the letter and withdrew. Night settled fully. Lamps were trimmed. Footsteps in the corridor thinned as the household quieted around the nursery wing. Rebecca stood beside the daybed, her own exhaustion rising like tidewater, and gathered the courage to ask the one practical question that had teeth. "When Master Julian sleeps through the next waking, may I go?" Ashcombe did not answer at once. He crossed to the chair opposite the bed and sat, elbows on knees, hands clasped, eyes on his son's face as if vigilance itself could bar further harm. "You will stay tonight," he said. She drew breath to refuse. He raised one hand, not harshly, and added, "That is for him, not for me." The distinction should have eased her. It did not. Outside, rain struck stone and kept striking. Inside, the fire settled lower with a soft collapse of ash. Rebecca looked at the sleeping child at the closed door, at the red mark where wax from 2 households had fixed her to 2 different fates in a single day, and understood that neither would release her cheaply, and the knowledge sat in her throat like unchewed bread, while the Duke kept his watch beside the daybed, and gave no sign of yielding. Julian stirred once, a small movement under blankets, and Rebecca reached to settle the cover at his shoulder. Ashcombe moved at the same instant from the chair opposite, his hand stopping a breath from hers, as if habit had pulled him forward before thought could weigh rank or propriety. He went still when he realised how close they stood. Firelight caught the scar at his neck and turned it pale gold against shadow. For one suspended beat his eyes met hers, hard and unreadable, and she felt the force of a man accustomed to command checking itself by visible effort. Then he withdrew his hand and stepped back. "He runs a fever?" she asked quietly. "Not yet." His voice was low to avoid waking the child. "You will wake him at the hour." The clock on the mantel in the schoolroom beyond the half-open door ticked with a measured, judicial sound. Rebecca glanced toward it, then to the narrow sofa near the hearth where Mrs. Davies had laid an extra blanket. The room was warm now, yet fatigue had worked into her bones so deeply that warmth only made the ache more legible. Her wet dress had been replaced by a plain borrowed gown of brown wool that smelled faintly of lavender soap and old cedar chests. Her own clothes hung somewhere near the laundry fires, and with them the familiarity that made her feel defended, however poorly. "I will wake him," she said. "After that I should leave." Ashcombe did not answer. He returned to the chair, sat, and folded his hands once more. The posture looked deliberate now, almost punitive, as if he had set himself a task and would not pardon himself from it. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of refusal. Rebecca drew a breath through her nose and forced steadiness into her voice. "Your Grace, if I do not return by morning, Mrs. Winterhale will send inquiries. She may send officers. She will say I have stolen papers, or silver, or anything that creates spectacle." His gaze stayed on Julian's face. "Let her?" "You do not know her." At that he looked up. "I know enough." The answer landed with a weight that stopped her next argument before it formed. She studied him across the sleeping child, trying to read where certainty ended and assumption began. Men of title often believed they understood an entire household from one dinner invitation and a polished lie. They mistook performance for truth because they had never needed to learn the difference. She had expected that same blindness from him in the yard, in the carriage, in this house. Yet he had watched too closely. He had noticed torn cloth, split shoes, hands that shook. He had remembered her name after hearing it once in rain and panic. Each observation felt less like kindness than like a blade sharpened to exactness. "Enough for what?" she asked. "For this." He shifted his attention to her left sleeve. "You hide a paper there." Her pulse struck hard once, then twice. Instinct moved her hand toward the seam before she caught herself. She held still. He continued, voice unchanged. "You touched that sleeve 7 times since dusk." Each time someone mentioned Winterhale House, solicitors or accounts. Once when Dr. Hale asked your name. Twice when you thought no one watched. Shame and alarm rose together, hot despite the room's temperate air. She had guarded that page for years. She had stitched it into cloth with fingers numb from attic cold. She had survived on discipline and secrecy. To have the pattern named so plainly made her feel exposed down to the bone. "You have no right to search me," she said. "I did not say I would." "Then why say any of it?" His jaw tightened. "Because you asked what I know." Julian shifted again and made a dry, uneasy sound in his sleep. Rebecca bent at once, set her hand lightly over the child's wrist, and waited until his breathing settled. She did not realize Ashcombe had risen until his shadow fell beside hers. He held out a folded cloth. "Your hand," he said. She looked down. The cut across her knuckles had reopened where she had braced against the bed frame. A fine line of blood marked the towel edge. She took the cloth automatically, then stopped. "I can do it." "Do it properly." It was an order, clipped and unadorned, and still it carried a shape of concern that unsettled her more than open pity would have done. She wrapped the cloth around her hand, pressing until the sting dulled. Ashcombe did not move away. He stood close enough that she could hear the controlled drag of his breathing, and close enough that the heat from his coat brushed the side of her arm. He had been in wet wool all day, through accident and command and argument, yet he seemed unaware of discomfort unless it belonged to his son. By the time the nursery clock marked 10:15, the house had fallen almost entirely silent. No carriage wheels in the courtyard, no servant traffic in the corridor, only rain, the soft settle of coals, and Julian's uneven sleep. Rebecca straightened from the bed and faced the Duke with what composure she could gather. "I cannot remain here by force." Something flared in his eyes, quick and cold, then disappeared behind that practiced stillness. "You are not here by force." "I asked to leave. You refused." "I prevented you from walking into a trap." The bluntness of it struck. "You presume much." "I presume nothing. I listened." He crossed to the mantel and picked up a small object Rebecca had not noticed earlier, a child's carved horse with one painted wheel chipped at the edge. He turned it once in his hand, gaze fixed on the toy rather than on her. "When Mrs. Davies brought your note to Seal, she hesitated. She has served this house 30 years. She does not hesitate without cause. I asked why." He set the toy down with careful precision. "She said your hand shook when you wrote Winterhale. She said you watched the door as if expecting a blow." Rebecca felt the back of her neck go cold. Mrs. Davies had been gentle. Mrs. Davies had also been observant. Ashcombe went on. "My groom delivered your note. He returned with the messenger who met him at the side gate, a boy in Winterhale colours. The message was verbal." His mouth hardened. "You were to report at once, alone, through the back entrance. No delay would be tolerated." The language was so familiar she could hear Mrs. Winterhale's cadence in it, smooth and cutting. Her stomach knotted despite the broth she had managed hours ago. "He may have embellished," she said, though the defence sounded thin even to her. "He repeated it twice, the second time to my steward." She looked away toward the rain-black window, fighting the old reflex to minimise harm before others could accuse her of dramatics. If she admitted fear, she ceded ground. If she denied it, she walked back into hands that fed on silence. Her father had taught her that numbers were protection because numbers could not blush or beg, yet no column could account for a woman's pleasure in humiliation. Ashcombe spoke again, quieter now. "You asked if I know her. I know leverage when I see it." The room seemed smaller, the fire too warm, the borrowed gown too soft against skin accustomed to rougher cloth. Rebecca set her injured hand on the bedpost to steady it. "She holds legal authority over me." "Temporary authority. She will claim more if she can." He gave one short nod. "Then she cannot claim you tonight." The words were simple. Their consequence was not. No stepmother released a compliant victim because a duke disliked her methods. No magistrate moved without documents, witnesses, timing. Rebecca had lived too long in procedural cruelty to mistake a single command for salvation. Yet this command had altered immediate facts. She was fed, dry, and not under Mrs. Winterhale's roof. Julian slept because she had stayed. Ashcombe had not softened, had not coaxed, had not made promises he could not enforce. He had set a boundary in the language he trusted. She met his eyes. "If she accuses me of impropriety, your name suffers." "My name survives weather." "That is not an answer. It is the only one you require." Frustration rose sharp and bright. "I require the truth." For the first time he looked almost weary, not weak, not uncertain, worn at the edges by restraint stretched too far. "The truth," he said, "is that I let urgency outrank your safety once today because I believed speed mattered more than people. I will not send you back tonight because I now know what waits there." She stared at him, unable to move around the sentence. He had not apologized. He had not spoken the word. He had said something stranger and, in its way, harder, an admission of misjudgment framed as action he would not repeat. For a man like him, it might have been the same currency under a different seal. Julian whimpered and turned his face into the pillow. Rebecca sat beside him and touched his shoulder until the sound faded. Ashcombe resumed his place in the chair, and the two of them kept watch in a silence altered by what had been said. At the hour she woke the child gently, offered water, counted breaths, and let him sink back into sleep. Ashcombe remained motionless through the entire ritual, eyes tracking every step, as if memorizing procedure for future storms. When she rose, dizzy with fatigue, the edge of the carpet caught her heel. She steadied herself against the bed rail before she fell. A hand closed around her forearm, firm and immediate. Ashcombe released her as soon as balance returned, but his fingers had left warmth through the wool. "You will rest," he said. "I can continue." "That was not a request." She almost answered with anger, then saw his hands where they rested on the chair arms. They were not steady. The tremor was slight, contained, but undeniable. Not fear now. Exhaustion held too long in check. "Your hands are shaking," she said, before caution could stop her. He looked down, as if the fact belonged to someone else. "They will stop." "Sit farther from the fire," she said, "and drink water. Your breathing is shallow." His gaze returned to her, surprise cutting through his reserve for one unguarded instant. Then that near-invisible shift at the corner of his mouth appeared again, not quite a smile, something closer to acknowledgement. "You give orders easily for a woman who claims no authority." "I give useful instructions," she said. His head inclined once, accepting the correction. He moved the chair half a pace back from the hearth and took the water she poured without comment. Near midnight, Mrs. Davies returned carrying 2 fresh candles and a thin packet of folded papers tied with plain string. She placed them on a side table and addressed the Duke in a low voice. "From Mr. Fenwick, Your Grace, brought by express from his chambers." Ashcombe did not touch the packet. "At this hour." He marked it urgent. Rebecca kept her eyes on Julian, but her pulse quickened. Fenwick was a solicitor name she knew, by rumour, a man retained by houses that preferred problems solved quietly before dawn. Ashcombe noticed her reaction. "Do not concern yourself with that tonight," he said. It was meant as dismissal from legal matters, perhaps as mercy. It landed as exclusion. "Those papers concern Winterhale claims," she said. "They concern me. They concern my son's safety first." The answer cut because it was true, and because it implied a hierarchy she could not contest. She folded the blanket edge back into place with deliberate care. Mrs. Davies, reading tension with practised discretion, set a plate of bread and cheese near Rebecca's elbow. "Eat, miss," she murmured. "You will not be of use fainting." Rebecca obeyed because disobedience now would only prove childish pride, She ate in small bites while Ashcombe broke the solicitor's seal and scanned the first page under candlelight. His expression did not change, but the room seemed to tighten around him. He read the second sheet more slowly, then held it over the flame just long enough to soften the wax at one corner before folding it again. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. His eyes lifted to hers. "Names." "Whose names?" "Men who witnessed signatures they did not witness." A chill moved through her, swift and absolute. The forged debt instruments, the structure beneath years of humiliation. She rose from the daybed, bread forgotten on the plate. "You have proof?" "I have direction." He retied the packet and set it out of her reach with no theatricality, only decision. "Proof comes at daylight." She took one step toward the table. "I can identify my father's hand from any copy. Let me see." "No." The refusal was immediate. Anger flared again, sharpened by fear. "You ask trust while withholding evidence." "I ask sleep. You are near collapse." "I am not fragile." "I did not say fragile." He stood, and the full height of him altered the balance of the room. Command returned to his posture, but underneath it she saw strain that had never eased, not since the yard, not since Julian first failed to breathe. "You will lie down for 2 hours," he said. "Mrs. Davies will wake you at 2 bells. Then you and I read every page together." She searched his face for evasion and found none. 2 hours was concession from a man who had yielded little else. It was also, she understood, protection disguised as regimen. If she slept here under his roof and witness, no messenger could drag her into a dark carriage lane on Winterhale's orders. She lowered herself onto the narrow sofa at last, blanket pulled to her shoulders, too tired to preserve pride upright. Ashcombe returned to the chair beside Julian and did not move again. Candlelight thinned his features into planes of shadow and bone. Rain kept striking the windows. The child breathed. The Duke watched. Rebecca closed her eyes to the rhythm of all three and felt, for the first time in years, that someone had drawn a line around her suffering and told the world it would go no farther tonight. At 2 bells, Mrs. Davies touched Rebecca's shoulder, and she came awake to candle smoke, banked coals, and the low murmur of rain easing at last against the panes. Julian slept without fever flush. His breathing was deep and even. Ashcombe was where she had last seen him, in the straight-backed chair, fully dressed, a stack of opened papers on the table at his elbow, and his eyes on her, as if he had never once permitted them to close. "Come," he said, "we work now." She rose with the blanket still around her shoulders and crossed to the table. The red-waxed packet from Winterhale House lay beside Fenwick's bundle. Its seal had blurred in the wet and then hardened again in ugly ridges. But Mrs. Winterhale's crest could still be read. Ashcombe slid it toward Rebecca. "Open what you were sent to collect." Her fingers hesitated only a moment before she broke the seal. Inside was an acknowledgement draft prepared for Mrs. Winterhale's signature and a second page bearing a blank line for Rebecca's witness mark. The language transferred residual Schmidt debt claims to Winterhale trusteeship in perpetuity. It named Rebecca as dependent without legal standing to contest. At the bottom sat a witness line already filled in by 2 men she had never met. "She meant to make me sign this tonight," Rebecca said. Ashcombe placed Fenwick's first sheet over it. The same 2 witness names appeared again under a separate debt instrument, dated 3 months after Matthias Schmidt's death. The signature above them carried her father's name in a hand too heavy, the M-shaped wrong at the second stroke. "She has used these men repeatedly," Ashcombe said. "Fenwick traced both. One is a dismissed clerk. One keeps books for gaming rooms near Bristol Road." Rebecca touched her sleeve seam. I can prove one payment she buried." He held out his hand, palm up, not as command now, but request. She broke the hidden stitches with a pin from Mrs. Davis's work tray and drew out the folded ledger page she had guarded against her skin for 3 years. The paper was thin at the creases, but legible. Matthias Schmidt's entries ran in clean columns. Harrow and Blight settled in full. Receiving stamp, date, amount. Ashcombe read it once, then again, slower. A muscle moved in his jaw. "You carried this alone." "She forbade me to show it." "To whom did you try?" "2 solicitors. One said he could not oppose Mrs. Winterhale without corroboration. One stopped returning messages." Ashcombe nodded once toward the corridor. "Mrs. Davies." The housekeeper entered at once, already dressed for morning, though dawn had not yet broken. She took in the page, the opened packet, and Rebecca's unstitched cuff. Her face did not change, but her eyes sharpened. "Send for my carriage," Ashcombe said, "and rouse Mr. Fenwick from his chambers if he is not already en route. We go to the magistrate at first light." Mrs. Davies inclined her head. At the door she paused and looked at Rebecca, not pitying, only steady. "I kept your dry clothes pressed, miss, and your own shoes are by the hearth. The split sole has been mended." By dawn the rain had thinned to mist. In Fenwick's offices, coal fires burned low and legal clerks moved like shadows between cabinets. Fenwick himself was narrow, grey-eyed and unsentimental. He read Matthias's ledger page under full window light, held it against known entries from shipping records, and compared ink flow with a magnifier. "This is authentic," he said. "And this," he tapped the forged Schmidt signature from Winterhale's debt packet, "is not merely false, it is clumsy." Rebecca felt the room tilt and right itself, not triumph, something quieter and more dangerous. Validation after years of erasure. Fenwick turned to Ashcombe. "We can petition immediate restraint of property pending fraud inquiry. Assault allegation requires witness statements." "I will swear mine," Ashcombe said. Fenwick looked toward Rebecca. "And Miss Schmidt," she lifted her chin, "I will swear to all of it." They crossed to the magistrate's chamber before the city had fully stirred. Wet cloaks dripped onto worn flagstones. 2 constables stood by the bench rail while Fenwick submitted affidavits, the authenticated ledger page, and the forged instruments with matching witness names. The magistrate, an older man with rheumy eyes and a meticulous hand, asked Rebecca to recount dates, rooms, and words exactly. She answered without flourish, each withheld meal, each forced errand, each struck blow disguised as correction, each paper she was ordered not to read. When she finished, silence held for a breath. Then the magistrate sanded his signature and nodded to the constables. "Mrs. Winterhale and named witnesses are summoned for immediate examination. Interim custody of contested Schmidt holdings is removed from Winterhale control, pending hearing." Ashcombe stepped back to give her room as she lowered her hand from the oath stand. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only she heard. "I believed her account of you. I believed you were careless with figures and prone to invention." Rebecca did not answer. He faced her fully, shoulders square, expression severe as ever and utterly without defence. "I wronged you when I believed her account. I apologise, Miss Schmidt." The words struck harder than any raised voice. She had imagined vindication often in cold attic nights. It had never included a duke standing still before her and naming his own fault aloud. "I accept your apology, Your Grace," she said, because truth required that also. By midday the matter had spread through Bath in the way scandal always did, faster than cabs and cleaner than law. Mrs. Winterhale was served immediately with the magistrate's summons, and did not submit quietly. She sent a message first, demanding attendance at the assembly rooms, where she had arranged patrons to witness what she called a vulgar conspiracy. Fenwick advised refusal. The magistrate, calculating public order, advised presence with officers nearby. Ashcombe asked Rebecca once, in private, what she preferred. "I am done hiding inside doors," she said. So they went. The assembly rooms smelled of wax, perfume, and damp wool, steaming dry near crowded hearths. Musicians waited in uneasy clusters. Conversations dropped when Rebecca entered on Ashcombe's arm, not with intimacy but with unmistakable protection. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-air. Augusta and Clara stood beside their mother in pale silk, both visibly shaken, both still trying on contempt because they knew no other posture. Mrs. Winterhale crossed the floor before anyone could intercept her, Rosewater preceding her like a banner. "You ungrateful girl!" she hissed, loud enough for the nearest circle to hear. "You would destroy the house that fed you." Rebecca held her ground. "You fed yourself with my father's name." The slap came fast, a bright crack in the charged room. Rebecca's head turned with the force of it. She did not fall. Ashcombe went absolutely still. Then he stepped between them and spoke without raising his voice. "How dare you touch the future Duchess of Norfield?" The room seemed to lose air. Augusta made a small strangled sound. Clara went white. "Mrs. Winterhale stared first at him, then at Rebecca, then at the magistrate's officers moving in from the side doors with Fenwick behind them, papers already open. "Mrs. Winterhale," the senior officer said, "by order of the Bath magistrate, you are to attend on charges of fraud, coercion, and assault. You will come now." She drew herself up, silk trembling. "This is absurd. I am a lady." "You are under warrant," he replied. She looked to her daughters for support. Augusta looked down. Clara stepped back. No one moved to shield her. As officers took her arms, Mrs. Winterhale's gaze snapped to Rebecca with naked hatred. "You think this makes you one of them?" Rebecca touched the stinging line on her cheek, then lowered her hand. "No, it makes me my father's daughter." They led Mrs. Winterhale out through the same central doors she had once used to make entrances time to be admired. The witness men were taken before dusk. By evening both had confessed to signing instruments they had not witnessed, naming payment from Winterhale accounts. Their statements were entered before the same magistrate who had heard Rebecca that morning. The disputed townhouse and remaining Schmidt property were placed in Rebecca's legal control under court supervision, pending full transfer. Fenwick handed her the inventory himself, each recovered item listed in careful script. "The mourning brooch was sold and cannot be traced," he said. "The library is dispersed, but title, rents and account rights are restored." She nodded. Loss and restoration sat together, neither cancelling the other. That night at Norfield, Julian ate broth at the nursery table and insisted on counting every spoonful to 10 and back again. His bandaged arm rested on a cushion. When Rebecca rose to return to her newly restored house, he caught her sleeve. "Will you come tomorrow?" She looked at Ashcombe. He stood by the hearth, not intervening, simply waiting. "If your father agrees," she said. "I agree," Ashcombe answered. Winter turned. By the second week of May, Rebecca had moved back into the Schmidt townhouse with 2 retained servants and Mrs. Davies's practical help in restoring order. Fenwick closed each legal matter in sequence, including the abandoned claims that could not be recovered from third parties. Those were marked formally as unrecoverable, and she signed the notation with a steady hand. She taught Julian his lessons 3 mornings each week in Norfield's schoolroom and audited her father's old ledgers in the afternoons, reclaiming both labour and name. Ashcombe remained severe with everyone else. With her he was precise, honest, and when wrong, no longer silent. On a clear morning in late June, in the small chapel at Norfield with Mrs. Davies and Julian in the front pew and Fenwick standing witness, Rebecca married the Duke of Norfield in a gown of plain ivory wool she had chosen herself. No orchestra, no glittering crowd, only vows spoken without ornament and kept without delay. When the register was signed, Ashcombe offered his arm. She took it. Outside, the rain had finally broken for good, and the stone steps were dry beneath her feet,